We now return to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the radio show discussing the honest truth about Illinois policy and politics. Here's AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with Ted Dabrowski, Vice President of Policy at the Illinois Policy Institute. And Ted, teacher strike this week. Thankfully not in Chicago this time, although that still is a pending matter. But in Seattle public school teachers striking over pay. And as you read the accounts of what the district offered and what the teachers want, it is eerily reminiscent of the Chicago teacher strike from a couple of years ago, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. We had a strike here 3 years ago, and a lot of the same issues that were discussed and fought over. Reading about, the strike ongoing right now in Seattle, and it looks a lot like what happened a few years back here.
Oh, well, let's get some more insight into what's actually happening on the ground in Seattle. We're now joined by Jamie Lund, who's an education policy analyst at the Freedom Foundation in Washington State. Jamie, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Oh, appreciate the opportunity.
So just give us a kind of a sense of the landscape there, what the district offered, what the teachers want, and how long this strike may go on.
Well, in Washington State, strikes are against the law, actually. There's no authority to do them, so they go as long as the courts tolerate them. The catch is that the district has to actually ask for a court order in order to end a strike in Washington, because our law doesn't actually have any teeth, nor does the collective bargaining agreement, which normally would be governing these things, in which, by the way, they promise not to go on strike. So it goes as long as the courts let it and the district lets it. In terms of what's being asked and offered, in Washington we fund education primarily from the state, and salaries explicitly are funded by the state. And they're actually prohibited at the local level from negotiating salary, but there's a loophole in that. And that's where you get this strange notion of local strikes and contract negotiations on salary for teachers. And there is a finite pool of resources for salaries or for any purpose at the local level. And the union is seeking to get this money diverted from its services to the salary increases that they want. And they originally were asking for 7% per year for 3 years, 21% wage increase, which is incredibly expensive and diverts a ton of money that could be used for other sorts of services at the school level.
And in terms of teacher salaries in Seattle and Washington State as compared to, kind of the median household income, where does that shake out?
Well, the average teacher salary in Seattle is $64,000 a year, something like that. And it's difficult to compare it to the median for the state or the region, because we're talking about people who have degrees in a sort of a professional position, and then there's how many hours and days do you work and all the rest of those variables. So they're really, in a monopoly education state like Washington, where you don't have any basis of comparison, enough compensation is really best determined by how many applicants you can get for a position. And at this point, there is no great urgency where people aren't applying for jobs in the Seattle school district. Now, in some topic areas, there might be, a science person or a bilingual special ed person or something. But that doesn't mean you need a general pay increase. That means you need specific increases for hard-to-fill positions. But, of course, the unions won't let that happen because they have no interest in, breaking ranks over letting the market actually determine prices.
Jamie, in Chicago, we have what we might consider one of the most militant unions in the nation, the Chicago Teachers Union. They're extremely powerful, extremely vocal and active. And when they struck back in 3 years ago, they got over 90% of the teachers to back that strike. So,
well, when they say 90% of what? 90% of the people that they were able to get to return a ballot or show up at a meeting? I mean, there's a lot of teachers who are apolitical, and there's a lot of teachers who are very altruistic in the work that they do. They just really don't want to be bothered with this. They didn't get attracted for this purpose. So I'm always suspicious of these high percentages, because there is a cadre of people who are aggressive, political, militant for the cause of the labor organizations and all of that. But so I take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and Jamie, that's fine. But I'm talking about the union leadership in particular, not the actual members themselves. But they did get good support regardless. And so we had a 1 week strike. 400,000 kids were out of school. What is the situation like there? I saw on one of your blogs that the WEA, the Washington Education Association, takes about $1,000 in union fees from teachers to operate their activities. So what is the situation like there with regard to the union?
Well, these things are very orchestrated. I mean, they're professionals. It's an $80 million a year industry, the workplace representation industry for teachers in Washington, and they're very, very good at what they do as far as marketing, as far as getting things done. The important thing for people to note, for citizens to realize, is the self-interest of employees getting this much domination over the policy decisions of any school district is not a good thing. A lot of times what the employees want is not in the interest of students. So in the case of Seattle, for instance, they're talking about, diverting millions of dollars from services to pay increases. Well, would you like to have, increased fees and less materials and buildings in disrepair but high-paid teachers, or would you rather balance those? That's why you elect a board, or that's why you have governing authorities making these decisions, and to let one interest dominate the others is a problem that really impacts everybody, including taxpayers.
We're talking to Jamie Lund, education policy analyst at the Freedom Foundation in Washington State, about the Seattle teacher strike. And so, Jamie, you just mentioned kind of elected leadership. That's one of the big points of contention in Chicago. We have an appointed school board right now. Some have argued that we should have an elected school board. It's unclear if that would make a material difference. But what's the balance of power in Seattle? Is it elected? Is it appointed? Does it matter?
Well, elected and appointed both have problems. We have just had a horrible Supreme Court decision made by elected judges. Well, the judges were all funded by public sector labor organizations to get into office in the first place. And so it makes me a little skeptical of whose interests they're representing, the public as a whole, or their donor base and the people with a particular ideological view. You get the same thing with appointees. The appointees are ultimately responsive to somebody who's elected, whether it's a governor or a city official or something like that. So there are warts on either system, either approach. The more interesting question is, how do you make sure that the public's interest in quality services, in accountability, in the most effective use of money, would you rather use dollars for this or for that? And one thing that we recommend is that collective bargaining, if you're going to have employees' self-interest as a major part of the decision-making of your school enterprise, have those meetings in open meetings, don't have them in secret meetings. And in our state, we've been battling. We have a permissive law. You may close the meeting. Well, they do in all cases have secret meetings. So when you've got a strike like Seattle, newspaper reporters even can't really figure out what's going on, and the union will market, we're fighting for better time with our students, and we're fighting for curriculum. But behind closed doors, they're saying, give us the money, and so the public needs to see what's going on, because these decisions impact the accountability. How easy or hard is it to get rid of a bad teacher? That's decided in these secret meetings. How much are you going to pay for the services that your family receives in education? Well, that's decided in these meetings. What does your teacher have to do to look after the interests of your students, or what can they ignore? That's decided. Discipline issues, a host of issues are in there. And now they're even negotiating on things like testing and what the curriculum's going to be and all of that.
So, Jamie, you mentioned the Supreme Court decision to, I guess, in some form, say charters aren't public schools. And then you've got strikes, and I read that there's more than just a Seattle strike. You've got strikes going on throughout Washington. What is the reform movement like in Washington, and is there any hope? And we're seeing more and more states add school choice and opening up educational alternatives. Where is it going in Washington?
Well, Washington State would be a good a moral lesson for the country. We are truly operating in a early 19th century Soviet style school system. Our commitment, as demonstrated by our union funded election or elected officials, is to the monopoly. And they've argued against charter schools just 3 years ago when it was on the ballot, talking about this crazy, radical, experimental notion, and I know that folks from around the country who were very comfortable with charter schools would scratch their head and think they were odd, but we really had that kind of rhetoric. So we are extremely backwards. One of the big ironies is that one of the major movers in the world of education reform is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation,
right? Exactly,
located right here in Washington, and they're fairly passive as far as what they do here because it's not fertile ground. They go elsewhere to work on things like innovations and options for families and smaller school approaches, and all the things that they're working on are generally elsewhere because our political climate is so dominated by the interests of public sector labor organizations. They dominate the elections from the school board level to the Supreme Court level, and we reap the fruit of that in a ridiculously prescriptive, monopoly, one-size-fits-all approach to education.
Yeah, tell Paul Allen to stop with the sports teams and rock and roll museums and focus on education reform. He is, Jamie.
Well, and to his credit, they did. I mean, they actually spent millions of dollars on the charter school initiative to overcome the union's millions of dollars just to get a reasonable law passed that would allow us to have 40 whole charter schools in the entire state. So they have been out for a while, and now they've stepped in and said, okay, let's do charter schools. This ought to work, and we're able to get the citizens to vote for it. But now we've got an elected Supreme Court which struck it down.
Jamie Lund, education policy analyst at the Freedom Foundation in Washington State. Thanks so much for your time and insights. Appreciate it.
No problem.